evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, bringing together prominent New Yorkers with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Drafting a policy to deal with the city's continuing problem of homeless people is complicated by the fact that so many reasons lead to the problem in the first place. Joblessness, high rents, deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, drug abuse, domestic violence, and plain bad luck all contribute to individuals and families finding themselves without a roof over their heads to call their own. These city attempts to help the homeless, or in the view of some to demonize them and hope that they go away, have run up against an aggressive community of activists and some activist judges who have forced a patchwork of requirements that several frustrated city administrations have tried to obey with varying degrees of earnestness. The scale of the problem is daunting. This week, the city provided shelter to almost 40,000 people a night, including 9,200 families with 17,000 children. That is almost double the demand of 2 years ago, and would be worse with the city we're not using a variety of programs to move people out of the shelters and into permanent housing. The latest battle is over a city attempt to eject unruly or uncooperative people from the shelters. The city says, "What do you want us to do with them?" The activists ask, "Where are they going to go?" We now join this debate with four people who have figured prominently in the debate over homeless policy in the city. Muzzy Rosenblatt was the first deputy commissioner of the Department of Homeless Services under Mayor Giuliani and currently is executive director of the BOWERY Residence Committee. Patrick Markee is the senior policy analyst at the Coalition for the Homeless. William Tucker is a columnist for the New York Post and writer for many publications who has written extensively on homeless issues. And Bill de Blasio is the chairperson of the New York City Council's General Welfare Committee and represents a district in Brooklyn, and his committee oversees the Department of Homeless Services. Muzzy, let me begin with you. How is the problem changed? You've seen it from inside the government, now you're seeing it from outside the government, from Giuliani up through now. How has the problem evolved?
Well, I think a lot has changed, particularly if you look back the 20-some years since the Callahan decree, the court situation that led to the agreement between the advocates and the city to provide shelter. At that time, we provided...
Well, the Callahan decree dealt with individuals, not with families.
And then subsequently led to the McCain decision to provide the same benefits to families. And at that time, we used large cavernous shelters. We didn't really understand what homelessness is about. What's changed is that we understand so much more. We now understand the issues of mental illness, substance abuse, lack of employment, how they contribute to homelessness and keeping people homeless. And now we have a network of services run by nonprofit providers and shelters, drop-in centers, outreach teams, housing programs, supportive housing programs, vocational programs to provide the services. Unfortunately, what hasn't changed is we still have people living on the street, and that's the tragedy.
Bill, a lot of this process, in talking about the Callahan decision and the McCain case, are courts running this system too much? Are the courts imposing... Are the courts fine-tuning a system that really ought to be run by a city administration?
Well, I think the result of having courts running it is that nobody has any control of the costs and nobody pays any attention to the costs. The Department of Homeless Services this year is going to spend close to $500 million. And that's in addition to the $500 million the city spends at the Housing Preservation and Development Department, and on and on and on. And that's basically why we have a $3.8 billion deficit.
Patrick, why shouldn't the city be able to eject people from the shelters who are uncooperative?
Well, let me answer the question this way. As Muzzy said, 20 years ago, the city entered into an agreement to shelter people with mental, physical, and social dysfunctions, and said that they're not going to leave those folks out on the streets. Before that agreement, people died on the streets. Robert Callahan, who was the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit brought 20 years ago, himself died on the streets the year before the agreement was signed between the city and advocates. What the city is proposing now is essentially what Mayor Giuliani proposed 3 years ago. If you as an individual were in a shelter and you missed curfew or you missed appointments with your social worker, you must be ejected from shelter to the streets for 30 days or more, as long as 180 days. And that would put you out into the elements, even in inclement weather. And essentially, we would see more people sleeping out on the sidewalks, and we'd see incredible harm and the risk of death to vulnerable homeless people.
Councilman, Bill, what should be done does the city, even in a very tough budget time, need to do more to prevent homelessness? And what could you do? I mean, people have bad breaks, rents are going up. How do you do it?
Well, Bob, I think you summarized many of the problems that lead to homelessness, and it's very, very tricky. as a problem to confront, because some of it, for example, the national economy, the local economy, we don't have the illusion that the city council or the mayor can control that, and individual misfortune that may occur to a family. There are so many causes, but there are some things I think we can do. First of all, when you talk about the money we're putting into the system, it's all about, at this point, it's all about dealing with the problem after it has occurred, as opposed to preventing the problem. Now, I think we've seen some things that really do prevent homelessness. Of course, affordable housing is part of the equation, and I commend the mayor for making some progress in terms of putting forward a plan that might bring us some real affordable housing in the city. We have a lot more to do on that front. But also, let's look at how an individual family can become homeless when there's a preventable option. For example, a rental subsidy or anti-eviction legal services. There are thousands of families in this city that, if they got a small offer of help from the city, could stay in their apartments, could stay in their neighborhoods, could keep their families together in the neighborhood where their schools are and their friends are and their family are. Anti-eviction legal services, a family that may have every right to stay in an apartment that it can afford, but for whatever reason, a landlord's trying to evict them, and it turns out that if they had proper legal help, they could stay. That help's only going to come from the public sector. In the end, the amount of money we spend on that type of preventative measure saves us quite a bit of money in the long term, because when you talk about the annual cost of sheltering a family, you're talking it could be as much as $30,000 a year. It's a huge, huge expense. Those preventative measures, for example, a $500 a month rental subsidy, $6,000 a year, it's a much better bargain for the city. It's also better for the family.
You know, I think Bill's actually hit on such a good point. I mean, the model that the city uses to approach homelessness is the emergency room model. We had this debate, I think, in the country 10 years ago around healthcare, where we realized that it costs less to do preventative medical care, to do ongoing treatment, than it does to wait for somebody to have a medical crisis because they don't have insurance, to wait for them to have an emergency and then turn up at the emergency room. We essentially use that model of dealing with homelessness here in New York City. And you know what? It's more expensive. More expensive than preventative care, more expensive than maintaining a stable, decent stock of affordable housing here in the city. And as the city has lost affordable housing over the last decade at a record clip, we are seeing more and more homeless families and more homeless people turning to the shelter system.
The unfortunate reality, though, is that when you are governed by litigation, and this was the challenge I faced when I was in government, is you are being sued or being fearful of suits to ensure you comply with the letter of the agreement. It's not a law, it's an agreement between two parties, as opposed to the spirit of it. The spirit sometimes takes its time. It recognizes that clients aren't perfect. It recognizes that government isn't perfect. But it says we strive to create the best possible system. New York City has the best system in the country, does more for anyone, anywhere else, than all the other cities combined. And yet we still have this problem, because as Bill says, some of these problems are national. The investments need to be wise, but there also has to be room to give these approaches time to work and an acknowledgement it may not be perfect. The city does things that aren't mandated. We do outreach, Bowery Residents Committee does outreach, to bring people into the shelter system, to actually fill it up. And if our interest was to just do the minimum required, why would the city encourage us to do that? So I think we've got to create time to let these things work, and I think we need to see, as we saw with the family system, a willingness to move away from litigation to creative problem solving, which means allowing room for government and providers and advocates to make mistakes and not be back in court as soon as it happens.
You know, Muzzy, I think you have a good point, and I think we saw an important moment a few months ago in terms of the McCain case, where the mayor and the Homeless Services Commissioner came together with the advocates and found an important middle ground. Mm-hmm. A three-person panel was appointed to help resolve the outstanding issues moving forward, and the problem was taken out of the court system per se. I think that was a historic step forward, and I think it had something to do with a sort of coming of age. The movement of folks supporting homeless people has learned a lot. I think the Bloomberg administration came in and looked at some of the issues and problems previous administrations had and said, hey, maybe there's a less confrontational way to approach this. I hope that becomes the model going forward. I think you're right. In the end, the court system shouldn't be involved in day-to-day administration of government unless it's the most dire of circumstances.
I hate to be the one to have to say the glass is half empty here, but it is half empty, because the city had the same opportunity, Mayor Bloomberg had the same opportunity to sit down with the advocates, with ourselves, to sit down with the providers, and come to the same agreement on behalf of homeless individuals. We're talking about people with mental illness. We're talking about people with substance abuse disorders, with physical health problems. City officials testified in sworn depositions that these are the people that would be ejected from shelter and denied shelter at the front door when they sought shelter under the plan the city's proposing now. And instead of coming to the bargaining table, instead of coming to the negotiating table, the city said, no, we're going to march into court.
Are there no conditions under which you think people ought to be ejected from the shelter?
You know, what's funny is currently, under the current system now, folks who are involved in criminal activity and violent behavior can be ejected from the shelter system for as long as a week. And we say, basically, if somebody's involved in criminal behavior, deal with that person. Have the police come and deal with them. There's no reason that somebody who's endangering other people should be allowed to continue that behavior. But the plan before the city, and I invite people to take a look at it, it's on our website at coalitionforthehomeless.org. The plan that has been proposed by Giuliani and is now proposed by Bloomberg is much broader than that. It says that, you know, if you miss your curfew 2 nights in a row, you could be put out of shelter onto the streets for 30 days.
Patrick, you know, I'm going to have to correct you on that, at least as it relates to the Giuliani piece, since obviously I was very involved in it. And we've discussed this before, that looking at what the state regs allow, and of course with the court it's focused on what the state regs, doesn't assume, which is what I think you're assuming, that the city is going to choose to do all that. There was never an intent to use this as a way to just get the numbers down, to punish homeless people for being homeless, to say, oh, you missed your curfew, and out you go. The idea was to ensure that there was the ability, if there are going to be rules, to have rules enforced. And in fact, I believe, and I think most rational people would believe, that when you set boundaries, most people abide by them. There's definitely an issue of mental impairment, and there was going to be a review of that, just as there is on the families. The city has lawyers who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, reviewing every eligibility decision. And I think some of those things, again, if we're willing to take a step back and not cast assumptions, I think if you look at the history of city services to the homeless under Koch, Dinkins, Giuliani, and Bloomberg, under Carey, Cuomo, and Pataki, different political ideologies and philosophies, different parties, there has nonetheless been this commitment to do and invest an incredible amount beyond what's mandated that I think we have to give some trust, because of evidence that it's been used responsibly, that government can make this work and not limit government, tie government's hands.
I think, Muzzy, the problem here is trust is a two-way street. I mean, the court, when it ruled blocking the Giuliani plan, and it blocked it based on sworn testimony, record evidence that people would be harmed by this plan, that an individual in a wheelchair who was homeless and had been sanctioned under that plan would be denied shelter at the front door. That was sworn testimony from a deputy commissioner at the Department of Homeless Services who said that. Under that record evidence, the court said, this is too much. The risk of error could result in harm to the individuals protected by this agreement. The city can come back with a new plan. If the city, as is evident, and the judge said this, cares about this population, they should come back with a new plan. And what we asked the Bloomberg administration to do was bring forth your new plan. Let's see your new plan. Let's see what it is, and let's talk about it. And they refused to have that conversation.
Bill, this is an impressionistic comment, is that in the 1980s, I believe that the homeless problem was worse than it is today, and at least there's a perception, and you saw, and maybe I'm incorrect, but there was a much more visible presence of homeless people on the street than I at least see today. I think I see a larger homeless presence on the street than I did, let's say, 7 or 8 years ago. But am I incorrect in that impression? I mean, what's your sense of this?
Well, I want to question the whole premise that everybody's talking about here. I'm just so far outside the discussion here, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to fit in. But let me start with the statement that rents are going up in New York City. Does anybody know what the median rent for an apartment is in New York City? Can I hear a guess?
$780.
Very good, very good. $780. $780. Is that a lot of money for an apartment?
Well,
$780 a month.
Let's consider the $780 means half the apartments rent below that,
Right,
half
half
above
the
it.
apartments
That
rent below.
includes public
Right.
housing.
So half of them.
That includes
should
rent-controlled housing.
Right.
Includes a lot of federally subsidized
My
housing.
point is this.
But they're all rented, that's the problem.
Right,
Those are
good
rented.
point,
They're all
right.
rented.
Apartments on the
Good point.
market
They're all
rent for over
rented,
$1,000.
Yeah, right, okay. So first of all, we have a system in New York called rent control. This is a famous system that's been tried for centuries and centuries. It always results in the same thing, which is a housing shortage. We have in New York a vacancy rate of about 3%. It's been 3% since 1945 when rent control was imposed. Does anybody know what the rental vacancy rate is in the rest of the country right now? Take a guess. A normal vacancy rate is 7%. Okay, it's 10%. 10% vacancies in the whole rest of the country right now. The big problem with housing in the country is they can't find enough tenants to go into the apartments that they have. In New York, we have the perpetual, ongoing, eternal problem of a housing shortage because we have a system called rent control. Now, any city that has Santa Monica is the homeless capital of the world. They have rent control as well. California, San Francisco is a great homeless city. They have rent control as well. Any place you have rent control, you're going to get low vacancy rates. When you have low vacancy rates, you're going to get lots of people who can't find apartments. So we'll call them the homeless. So that's why we have a lot of homeless people in New York City.
Let me just answer that. There's two premises there that absolutely need to be challenged because they're completely wrong.
Go ahead.
One is that rent control somehow dissuades developers from producing housing. Any new unit of housing that's built in the city without a subsidy
Okay, I don't
is
wanna go through
immediately
it. Yeah,
not
right,
controlled, is not rent controlled.
Why
It's
does
not
New
under
York
rent
have a
control.
3% vacancy
New York
rate?
City's not producing enough housing to meet population growth. Second premise we need to answer here, if getting rid of rent control would lower rents, I want to see the evidence. I don't know why the landlord lobby, the real estate lobby, goes up to Albany every few years to lobby for the elimination of rent control if they think it's going to actually result in
It
them
probably wouldn't
earning
raise
less money.
rent. First of all,
and
it
lowering rents.
wouldn't raise rents, but it would make low price apartments available. All the cheap apartments now are in the hands of rent controlled tenants. We don't know whether they're rich or poor or what. The point is they've been there for 25 years, so nobody can ask. The other thing is, when I was in college, I hitchhiked around the country once, and I got to Chicago, and I had about $15 in my pocket. And when I got to Chicago, they had what they call partition hotels. They were actually old factories, and what they'd done is taken these old factory floors and just put up partitions, so you had a space of about the size of this stage here, and you rented it for $2 a night. And I paid $2 a night. I remember going in, closing the door, and a voice that's standing right next to me, it's pitch dark, he says, "Why don't you slam it again?" The guy was 3 feet away from me, but he was in the next partition, okay? Now, do we have that kind of thing in New York anymore?
Not much. Flop houses we had on the Bowery. That's where we
Right.
started.
Do they have that kind of thing in Chicago anymore? No. You know why? Because they were all zoned out. And they were closed down because of
You think that
code violations and this and that and the other thing.
But I think
you
you're
gotta-
assuming that and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
That it's about housing. I mean, the folks who are living on the
It's
street.
not about housing. So why are we talking about high rent centers? It's not about housing.
Well, I didn't bring it up.
Well, somebody else then.
Okay.
Why are we talking about high rents?
I think if we're going to talk about it, I think housing is a component of it, and for some people, the lack of affordable housing
So it
is
is a
surely it.
component.
But if we're talking about people living on the street, which, Bob, I think you were asking about, are the numbers up, and why are they up, and what's going on, is we're seeing people, and particularly now, not only are we seeing people on the street again, but we're seeing them much frailer. If we aren't looking at homelessness as a public health issue, a public health concern of mental illness, of substance abuse, and looking for health care and treatment and ways to help people. If we just take somebody who's an addict, who's been living on the street for 5 years, who's got all sorts of medical ailments, who may need appropriate medication but has been medicated with drugs and alcohol because they can't get on Medicaid and they can't get their entitlements straight, and we put them in an apartment, they'll be off the street, they'll be out of sight, out of mind, but they're not going to be healthy, they're not going to be better off, and arguably there's still going to be a burden, a social burden, and a social cost.
Well, I think also that it seems to me that there's that when you discuss social pathologies and social problems, that you can look at it on an aggregate basis, but people suffer they suffer one by one, and everybody has their own story, and I think what Bill is, Bill, I think you're talking more about what's going on with individuals. And when you look at the number of families that are into this system, I mean, how many, I would suspect, if I was going to generalize about families that were in this system, that it's very largely single mothers with children. Perhaps the women have, no experience being.
How many are living on the street
being
the day before they come in?
breadwinners, and
None.
None, right?
and
No
being
families on
able-
the street in New York.
Can we hear that? Can we repeat that now? How many families are living on the street the day before they come in?
None.
Thank you.
None because of the
So they're not
court,
really homeless.
because of the court protection, 20 years old, which has essentially mandated the delivery of emergency shelter to homeless families and children.
With eligibility criteria.
With eligibility criteria. In other cities in this country, you see families sleeping on the streets, you see families sleeping in abandoned automobiles, abandoned buildings, you see kids out on the sidewalks with their parents. I don't want to overdraw this picture, but because we have this legal protection here in New York City, you don't see that, and you also don't see the numbers of deaths and injuries on the scale that you see in other communities across the country.
Now, let me ask, what happens if a family stays in the system for a year? What are they eligible for?
Housing.
Housing, right. At city
Arguably before a
expense.
year, I think. I mean,
Yeah, it's only right.
at some
yeah.
point. but-
Making
So-
use, I assume, of either New York City Housing Authority or Section 8 housing. The
Correct.
city has
Major
used a
sources.
variety of programs to kind of
Correct.
put those people into permanent
So,
housing.
if,
But let
so
me
if
say-
you're doubled up with your sister or something like that, and you want to get a housing, your own apartment.
You think people are
what's-
going into the system in order to
I
try to play the
certainly
system?
do, and it's been documented. I certainly do.
in
It was
significant
documented
numbers.
10 years ago that the system was simply going to attract people in on the promise that they could have permanent housing.
Well, and that's why we instituted eligibility criteria, to make sure that with a scarce resource, it was allocated. I mean, there is no question about it. I mean, this I'll agree with Patrick. There is a housing crisis, and I don't understand enough about the economics of rent control to debate
That's
it.
a good place to start, though, let me tell you.
All right. Well, and I think we agree there too. And the question is how to solve it. So there are
If there were
hundreds of
4
thousands
people
of
on the
families.
city council who understood the economics of housing, we might be better
Well,
off.
perhaps this one. There are hundreds of thousands of families in this city living with other families who don't have their own home.
Right.
But the shelter system shouldn't be their only venue to get housing, and unfortunately for some it may be. And so what we tried to do, and we didn't address enough the points that Bill were taking, was saying, well, all right, if they're not truly homeless, they may not have their own home, but they're not going to go out on the street, they're not going to be asked to leave. How do we better address those issues in a responsible, good investment way? So we turned people away and said, look, if you can cope where you are, this is not what emergency shelter is for. And we created eligibility criteria thoughtfully, fairly, with the endorsement of the court.
I dispute the fairly, but
And, well, that's why we're here. And I think we did it responsibly because we still didn't see families on the street. And the tragedy of it, if you will, on one level, is that if you are in a family shelter, and because, again, the pressure of litigation to do immediate services, you move to the front of the line. The waiting list for NYCHA, the Housing Authority apartments, which are arguably the best in the country, even if there may be some issues in some
I grew
developments,
up in one,
are the
right.
best in the country, is a 12-year waiting list. But if you live in a family shelter, you move to the front of the line.
Wow,
Not because you're a better
that's-
family,
yeah,
not because you're necessarily more deserving than the others, but because we don't want to build more shelters, so we got to keep the system fluid.
So going to the
Section
shelter is
8,
a good way to get jumped to the head of the line. in public
Section 8
housing.
is even worse. Section 8, at least when I left the administration, we don't do families now, so I don't know, I can't speak to it, but at the time, you couldn't apply for Section 8 anymore. There was a moratorium on applications, still the case, for families. But if you're in the shelter system, the few Section 8 vouchers that are available go there, again, so that the system moves. And if you're trying to manage the system with the litigation on your back and knowing that if one family is at the emergency assistance unit, the intake center for families, 1 minute longer than they're supposed to, you're going to be brought back into court, which is why the moratorium, I think, is so historic. You can't plan for housing because you've got to make sure you've got shelter, and the only way you have shelter is you keep putting families to the front of the line. It is, if we were trying to devise good public policy and a good system, this is not what we would come up with. I don't think any of us would.
But it's devised within this chronic shortage of housing. I mean, I keep going back to, let's take a big step back. The 150,000 doubled up renter households in the city who have a median income of $10,000 a year. That's the statistic.
But you don't think they should
Who
all
are-
come into the shelters?
How-
Who are living doubled up in housing. So families that become homeless because they get evicted, families that become homeless because they're fleeing their batterer, families that get homeless because of such severe overcrowding in the apartment that it's a health and safety hazard to those families who turn to the shelter system. What we've done, because of the dramatic cutbacks by the federal government in housing assistance, because of cutbacks under the Giuliani administration in housing assistance, is we've rationed the small supply of public housing and Section 8 vouchers and city-funded apartments that we have. We've rationed them to the neediest folks. Instead of looking at a comprehensive solution that says, let's stop them entering our system in the first place, let's get them the assistance they need.
Bob, I want to pick up on that point and on Bill's point. Let's realize how much times have changed. And I could understand abstractly an argument about rent control. I don't happen to agree with it, but I can understand where it's coming from.
That's a start.
But I would go to a different root cause when it comes to affordable housing. For decades, there was a perceived responsibility on the part of federal and state government to produce affordable housing. Now, you can argue whether that's good or bad, but let's just look at facts for a moment. from the 30s on till the 70s, it was typical for a large number of units to be produced, public housing, other types of subsidized housing. Also, the Section 8 program continued to grow from its inception until basically the Reagan years. The Gingrich Congress, when it came in the early 90s, really ended the last vestiges of the federal commitment to developing subsidized housing. At a time when we also saw in a city like this, and I think other cities around the country, increasing housing prices. So I don't think there's any one cause here. I think there's a lot of different pieces that came together. It's a little bit of a perfect storm that led to a lot of families not having very many choices. I guess when I talk about some of the preventative measures, I think there's an interesting kindredness with some of the points that Bill's raising, because I would love to skip the step of the public sector. I actually believe there's an argument that left and right crossover when it comes to things like rental subsidies and Section 8, because you're still dealing with the private market. You're allowing people to stay in their communities and hopefully contribute to their communities, and it's the smallest possible government investment. What I find ironic is that the last two administrations have not embraced it. And I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm trying to say I would actually think the more ideologically conservative measure would be to use the least publicly elaborate methodology and use the rental subsidies, because it's sort of the easiest, simplest, smallest way to keep people from entering the shelter system.
I think you've got the same model when you're talking about homeless individuals with mental illness and other disabilities who are on the streets, who are in our shelter system. Major study by the University of Pennsylvania, released a couple years ago, tracked the cost to the public, to the taxpayer, of having a mentally ill individual who's homeless stay in shelters, stay on the streets, use hospital care at an enormous rate, and the cost to the taxpayer of having that person in an apartment with social services on site that would ensure that they're taking their medication, that they're involved in therapy and treatment. And you know what? It's exactly the same cost. So take the ideology out of it. You know, let's step back from the ideology and let's talk about what works. The reason you saw fewer people sleeping on the streets of New York City in the early 1990s was because of a major initiative by the state and city governments under the Cuomo and Dinkins administrations to build exactly that kind of housing, supportive housing. Unfortunately, the Pataki and Giuliani administrations has stepped back substantially from that commitment. And we're not seeing that housing being built anymore. We're seeing more people on the streets and more people in shelters at greater public cost.
You're being signaled.
Do you want to?
No.
Oh. Yes. I will point out that I grew up in Linden houses in East New York, and I did a story in 1987. It was the 30th anniversary of the opening of the project, because we moved in when it was brand new, and in those years, NYCHA alone was producing 15,000 new units a year. Mm-hmm. And in the early years of the 1980s, federally assisted housing was under 500. And so, you know, I mean, I will never be convinced that housing production is not.
Can I
not
dissent
a big
again?
part of the problem. Absolutely,
Okay.
I would expect
New York
no less.
City has not only the largest component of public housing in the country, but it has more public housing than the next 10 cities on the list. It has more.
Because we don't tear it down.
How do other cities do it? How do other cities get away with not having to build an individual apartment for every individual that comes along? They have a free housing market. New York City has destroyed the private sector in housing. How many people like their landlord? Okay,
Well,
there you are.
in fairness to many of the people who are living in public housing,
A landlord is a pariah in New York because he tries to provide housing.
coming from public housing, and the housing authority is a landlord, and they do charge rent, and most of the people who live in public housing pay rent. And most of the people who live in public housing work. And so, you know, we shouldn't, you know, kind of dispel the notion that everyone who's living in public housing is freeloading. But I think
I'm just saying New York has more public housing than anybody else in the world.
because
and you still say, well, the problem is we need
Chicago
more
can't run
public
it, they
housing.
tear it down. Newark, they can't run it.
No,
we
they
all
never
watch the
built
Nightly
as much
News.
to begin with
They
as
tore
it
it
was.
down.
No, but
because they
look
couldn't manage
at the record on housing production in New York City. When were the decades when the most housing units were built?
1920s,
The
before
50s,
rent control.
The 50s, the 60s, because of major public investment, the Mitchell-Lama program.
Well, you had
federal
rent
housing
control
programs.
at that point.
What's a decade where we didn't see housing production?
Every
The
decade since
the
1945.
The 1990s, when the city's population grew by 450,000 people, we only built 82,000 new units of housing.
How many did we build in the
because of
1920s? We
very
built
little public
100,000 units a year in the 1920s because you didn't have rent control. If you ever since 1940, look, there's always little spurts of stuff. Nobody builds right now. The Mitchell Lamas are trying to get out from under after 20 years, and they're being cut off because you know, we're going to betray them too. Who in their right mind would build housing in New York? Every once in a while, somebody's enticed into it. But the point is that
Well, who in their right mind would build housing in Iraq and Baghdad? And yet I surmise
That's
that
a
we'll
good
be
analogy, I
we'll be
guess.
building more public housing, if you will, government.
how about
housing
private housing?
in Iraq
There's a lot
than
of
we'll be
private
building in
housing
New York City, or probably in all the cities in the United States combined in this next year.
I go back to
Never
Bill's-
mind construction of schools, textbooks in the classroom, and things that aren't on our agenda for tonight.
I go back to Bill's point. It's not a private-public dichotomy. That doesn't exist, because what you're talking about is public subsidy to drive private investment. And that's the model that's worked in New York City. Mitchell Lama did it.
But it does
the
work in New
federally
York City.
subsidized
The
housing.
the
It's
vacancy-
absolutely worked. The problem is we've got so little public investment coming now that the private sector.
If we only had
fill
invested
the gap.
5 times as much, we'd be all right, right? Why, how is it every city in the country has a vacancy rate of 10% right now, and New York has 3%, and San Francisco has 3% too?
But Bill,
with
don't
high
you think the
homelessness.
private sector would embrace nothing more than public subsidy? Don't you think?
Well,
when you
sure,
look-
who wouldn't?
Right,
I'm
when-
saying
but
you don't
when you
need a
look-
public subsidy.
I question that on the level of the kind of costs that housing has nowadays. I don't. If you take the median that you told us about,
Yes.
which means what we need is apartments that rent for $400, $500 a month. I'm just not sure in this economic environment that you would see production at that level. But put that aside, the private sector has throughout American history taken great strides forward because of public investment. Some of it quite conscious and open, some of it unfortunately a little underhanded, but that's the reality. Why shouldn't we today be sparking the production of affordable housing and keeping people in existing private housing with some type of support?
Let me ask you this. Do we have price controls on office rents in New York City?
No, because we have a glut. And let me
No,
propose.
no. You jumped ahead. Do we have no? What's the vacancy rate of offices in New York right now?
It's actually below the national average.
25%.
Cranes reported
Is it
this
too
week.
expensive to build in New York? Well, do we have to subsidize developers to build
sure
office
do.
space? No, because there's a free market, so
Wait
people
a
build
minute.
it.
We're
You're saying
subsidizing
we're not
them.
subsidizing companies in New York City right now.
To build offices?
tax abatements
Yes,
and
yes.
tax incentives to get companies
Wow.
to come and build here?
But I
So what?
think, I think the real issue with decontrol and the real fear, because it's a political issue as much as it's an economic issue, is where are people going to go? I think you need to create the supply first,
Yes,
and then,
right, yeah,
and
yeah,
the
right.
problem is, and I don't think that the two are being put together in the
Yeah.
debate. And I think arguably there may be a political compromise that says, that was the problem with deinstitutionalization. Great idea. We shouldn't be locking up people just because they're mentally ill in hospitals.
Here's
but
my-
we didn't create any community services before we deinstitutionalized.
Right, I absolutely agree. Here's my proposal. And honestly, I think the future of New York City depends on this, quite frankly, because this city is going down the tubes right now. But we'll get that later. 5-year plan. You're going to, first of all, in 5 years, rent control will be removed by constitutional debate. It can never be imposed again, except by unanimous consent of all New Yorkers living and dead. Okay? So we got rid of it. Now, we go borough by borough. Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan. Every year, the controls come off in that borough. Meanwhile, the city says to developers throughout the country, there are never going to be any more regulations. You can come and build housing here anywhere you want. We will not, all zoning restrictions are off. Just put it up right now. Do you think people would do it?
The developers won't do it.
They won't? Oh, come on. You don't know
get
anything
your-
about housing.
No, I know about housing.
I'm not sure
You don't
you-
know
I'll
the
tell you
first thing about housing.
I'll tell you, the New York City Partnership,
God.
which is the Chamber of Commerce of the city,
They don't,
did a study, and they found that if you built a unit of housing, unsubsidized, none of the restrictions you're talking about, the asking rent that you would have to have
That's
to make it
not the point.
just to pay for your investment is $1,200 a month.
how long does housing last?
80% of New Yorkers don't make enough money to afford
How
that
long does a
apartment.
housing unit last when it's built? Who was Harlem built for?
Well, they last a long time. I mean,
Built for-
New York's
right.
old housing
Yes.
stock is a
Yes,
good housing
you do
stock.
housing. Once it's up, it's there forever. All you have to do is put up about 500,000 more units, and it would be you'd have 10% rent.
And who's going to put those up?
The
and-
private sector. Look,
And they're going to put those up, and it'll be affordable for the majority of New
no.
Yorkers.
The point is, well, if you get rid of all the regulations so people don't hang on to their rent-controlled apartments like family heirlooms, then people move. And they move to apartments they can afford. So people have money live in expensive apartments, people who have middle incomes live in middle apartments, and people without much
But a
money
lot of
live
those-
in the
but a
cheap
lot of those-
apartments.
but a lot of those
now we have the
people-
rich people living in the cheap apartments because
the-
they were there 25
but
years ago.
That's not true.
But the rich people who live in those cheap apartments, if they left, those cheap apartments would be astronomically high. why. But that's the,
But
because
Bill,
that's the
there's
essence
a
of your
logistical
argument.
issue even more, which is,
I'm gonna-
it's not like we got, open plains here. Where I think the only way,
I can think
I think
of
while New York
places.
housing is physically solid, you're not going to build it without tearing things down. There's really no place to put it with the
4th Avenue,
economies of
Brooklyn is
scale
going
that
to put
make
up
it.
12-story buildings now. It's going
All right, let me go
beautiful.
to let me go to questions. If you would ask a question, sir, you have a question. I identify the campus you're from and ask the question.
Right. I'm from Brooklyn College. I would like to ask, is it William Tucker, the fellow who was arguing against rent control? Sir, wouldn't putting a cap on the income of rent control recipients solve the problem?
Yeah, they've done that now, and they're trying to get rid of it.
Much better, but, and question is though, but how would getting rid of rent control fix the current problem? I mean, how would it fix the immediate problem of homelessness and high rents?
Right. The only way, that's a 5-year plan. The only way you're going to have housing for people is to build housing. You can stand here and talk about, this passing this law and passing that law is never going to do a thing unless somebody gets out there and physically builds housing. Now, the people who build housing are called developers. So you have to live with developers, and you have to allow developers to develop. And the way to have developers develop is to let them build in a market where they can charge a price that they, when they're finished. So we'll just, if you phase in the housing over a 5-year plan, you will create enough new housing so that old housing will open up, and the problem will solve itself.
Yes, ma'am.
Rotha Hunt, Medgar Evers College. This question is for Mr. Muzzy Rosenblatt. You mentioned that New York City has been known to do things that are not mandated. What I'd like to know is, can you give us an example of what's not mandated, as well as explain why these things are done?
Sure. First, if I can do the second part, I think the reason they're done is because I think there is a commitment among government and providers who are basically, the entire system is now run by provided by nonprofit social service agencies, that we need to solve problems and not just do the minimum. So one of the things that is done that isn't mandated is outreach. At the Bowery Residence Committee, we have vans on the street 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we operate a 24-hour hotline that's actually staffed by people, 212-533-5151, where we actually encourage people to call, clients to call, the public to call, so that we can go in and help people and help them come in. Not mandated. Drop-in centers was a model that was developed when it was recognized, particularly for mental illness and other people who were just very resistant to services, that to go from living on the street, which, if you put aside that you or I may not want to live that way, folks are very independent, very self-reliant, make their own rules and abide by them. And to go into a very structured environment where everybody eats, sleeps, and does things at the same time is a huge dramatic change. Drop-in centers were created as a model that was a lower threshold, more flexibility that people could come into. And then the housing at the back end, very logical, let's build housing. Arguably, the debate we were having is how much and who pays for it. But rather than keep building shelters to meet the minimum standard and having 1,000 men or 500 women living in one shelter, and the shelters have gotten much smaller. They've been downsized. Government, the Fort Washington Armory, you probably know very well, had 990 beds on the drill floor. It now has 200 beds.
Because of
and
a
it's
lawsuit.
a mental health treatment.
Because of a lawsuit.
The Bedford Atlantic Armory had 900 beds, now has 350.
Because of a lawsuit.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. Ariana Rodway, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I have a question for Mr. Markee or Mr. Rosenblatt. For a single mother who's been in the system over a period of time and she's been in shelter with her child or children, if she's been in the system for a period of time and housing is not granted to her, what options does she have? Is she put out on the street with her child, or is there some contingency for a time period?
Well, just to take a stab at the question, I mean, because of the legal protection for the family, they would not be put out of shelter if they had no place to go, and I think we can agree that's a good thing. I mean, one of the real problems is that families are staying in shelter for longer and longer periods of time because of the shortage of this housing that we talked about. The average stay for a family in the shelter system used to be 6 months. It's now over 10 months. Families are waiting longer and longer. And might I add, this is not what I think most people have as their sort of stereotype of a homeless family, of a welfare mom and her 2 kids. We're talking about a lot of working families. We're talking about, 2-parent families that are, where both parents are working, the working poor, literally cannot find apartments on the private market that they're going to be able to afford. So clearly, I mean, there's a real correlation between the number of homeless families who are in our shelter system and the number of apartments that are being provided for those families.
But then at the same time, litigation, the absurdity of the litigation has forced the city, as you pointed out in a hearing, that the city is actually renting apartments at thousands of dollars a month, well beyond the $780, to place families in the shelter system while they're waiting for housing. They're in an apartment, in a building, not even in a shelter, not even in a facility, not even with social services should they need them. And so, because God forbid that someone comes in, if we can, and hopefully this moratorium will allow us to come up with a rational housing policy that doesn't require these absurd reactions. That
Well,
the
I
city
think
has
we have
take.
to disagree there, because the city has two policy perspectives or two approaches it can choose anytime a homeless family presents itself. You could prevent the homelessness, you could provide them with housing assistance, keep them from having to enter the shelter system, or a family that's in one of those apartments that the city rents from private landlords at $3,000 a month, you could provide that family with a rent subsidy at a fraction of that cost. Give the family the lease to the apartment, move them into the apartment. One less family in our shelter system, one more family in a permanent home, and less money to the taxpayers. I mean, that's a win-win.
I think Patrick makes a good point, but I do think we have to sort of keep our eyes on the goals in the here and now. Despite Bill's points about the reforms that he'd like to see, what I'm talking about is sort of in the context we have today, what are the realizable goals? I do think a realizable goal is to try and move to sort of absolute democracy, meaning instead of having to revert to the courts, that we actually can get the legislative branch and the executive branch to come into enough agreement to solve these problems without needing a court to play that role. Now, in fairness, I don't doubt for a moment that had the advocates not taken legal action, in many of these cases, things would be much worse. So how do you find that balance point? For one brief and shining moment, we found it recently. I hope we can find it again. In the Callahan case, I and a lot of other folks in the council have been dubious that the city's ideas are going too far, and we feel that anything that might lead to an increase in visible homelessness is actually not only bad for the homeless folks, but it's bad for the city. It's bad for our economic recovery. It's bad on a whole lot of levels. But the model, the goal should always be, can we get to a common ground between the various branches of government and the advocates and keep it out of the court system? The other piece of the equation, you're right, the scatter site program you're referring to, $3,000 a month to house a homeless family in a private apartment. It's like buying a luxury apartment on Fifth Avenue. It's crazy. Again, a here and now, I think, better thing to do is to turn to those preventative approaches. So I think you both have a very fair point, but it's sort of a gradation of starting with what are the immediate solutions just to knock down the numbers and not always have to answer on the back end by producing more and more shelter space. And then what is a way to encourage a actual policy-making process, not a legal process, that we can actually solve the problem in an amicable fashion.
Well, and I agree. I think the legislature should be the check and balance on the administration, and that's where policy should be made. So you asked rhetorically, but I assume you believe that the legislature can take the responsibility of ensuring that the basic rights and the policy is sound and that the rights are protected, and that we don't need courts to do that.
I believe the legislature should do that, and if it has failed to do it sometimes, and that's why the advocates have to step in. But I actually believe you're right. In the perfect world that we need to move towards, the legislature picks up the baton from the advocates and does that work.
Until we reach that perfect world. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, hello. My name is Janina Scarlett. I'm from Brooklyn College. And my question is for Mr. Rosenblatt. You mentioned that the rules and regulations for shelters were put in to regulate and more control, not to punish. What about people that take night classes and can't get to the shelter on time? A friend of mine had a job and was taking night classes that would get out at 10 o'clock at night, and there was a time that he could not make it to shelter on the time of curfew and was not allowed in. What about those people? How does that justify those rules?
Well, one, I'd like to meet him. I'd like to have him in one of our programs. We have a shelter on the Bowery called the Palace. It's a 72-bed residence for working men. Often, kind of the least thought of, I think Patrick will say, there's this assumption you can't paint people all with one brush. Everybody's got a different story. And a lot of our folks work, in non-traditional work. They're not working Monday, Friday, suit and tie, 9 to 5 like me. Their first jobs are going to be after hours, or they're going to be going to school and doing other things. And so we give night passes. We encourage that. Anything that somebody can do to work, to hold themselves together, that can move towards their individual advancement, toward their individual goals. And if other shelters aren't doing that, well, that's irresponsible, and that's where the role as a city as regulator
How long
has to
is,
step in.
how long, if somebody comes to one of the residences that you run, how long are they in one of those residences? How
Sure.
Ideally, well, not ideally, I mean,
Right.
routinely, how long does it take somebody to move through that
The
system?
average now is about 12 months. We've got 46 of the 72 men in that residence. And we also have services for women. I don't want to, but in this place it's for men. 46 of them have jobs. 46 of them are working. And they're saving. They're saving money to rent an apartment because we don't want people running off right away and say, we want to make sure people have budgeting skills, financial management skills. And in 12 months, and in fact we're about to open a 24-unit residence on the Bowery also, for folks coming out of that environment and hopefully building more of that.
I mean, I would just like to sort of jump onto that point and say, those kinds of innovations, the innovative, successful programs, shelter-based programs that the private shelter providers have put in place over the last decade have happened in the context of the Callahan Decree. By having the Callahan protection, we've still been able to build on that floor, on that basic level of protection for individuals. We've been able to build a system that is much better and that addresses some of the service needs that people have, job training, mental health programs. But I think the question, though, if somebody missed their curfew, again, under the plan that's been put forward by the city, and let's not talk about what would be a good plan or what people mean to do or what they don't mean to do, what city officials, intend to do or what they don't intend to do, on what they've said on paper and presented to the courts, under that plan, somebody who missed curfew routinely would be put out of shelter. Somebody who missed a day of work at a job training program at a shelter, put out of shelter onto the streets. Is that a good solution? We think it's not, and that's the reason you have to have those protections.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, my name is Cordelia Uchiakakura. I'm from McGivers College. I don't have the exact statistics, but I understand that a good percentage of homeless people come from out of the state of New York. How then does the eligibility criteria work?
It's 15%, right? 15% of the people go in the shelter were from out of state or out of...
5%, according to
happened
the
to
city
15?
statistics.
I think that was out of the city, but included upstate.
I mean,
okay.
part of the
15% out of
is
city.
part of the underpinning of your question is, do you think people are lured to the city? They
Yes,
come to the city in
because of
order to
the
take
policies,
advantage of
yes.
the system. Is that?
I would just answer that question by saying, I mean, this is sort of the myth of the welfare magnet, and it's something that
Why is it a myth,
I think sort of right-wing commentators for years have tried to sort of blow this myth up. The reality is that there's really no evidence for it. I mean, New York is a city of mobile people. It's a city of migrants. I think you'd probably find that many more than 5% of the people that come to the city, are from out of the city or from out of the country. We know that a third of New Yorkers were born outside of the United States.
But do they come to the homeless shelter the first night?
Well, that's not what the study showed. So,
Well,
But let me-
15%.
Let me raise this point because I actually think, as someone who commends what the advocates are doing and has got some concerns about some of the steps the administration has taken lately, I do think we have to look in the eye an issue like this. The public, I think the public applauds when we say, let's prevent a problem before it starts, and let's spend less money to keep people in their neighborhood rather than spending more money to have a family in a shelter. I think the public applauds not only because it's more humane, but because it's more cost efficient. And Lord knows the New York City taxpayer is hit coming and going and is suffering enough financially. I think when the newspapers report that there's a significant number of people coming from outside the city and getting shelter in the short term, the taxpayers deserve a clear answer on it. I don't have that answer. I mean, this is, I trust that Patrick makes a good point. I think some of this is overblown. On the other hand, I might have a little common ground with Bill on this point. Until we can show that there are some controls in place to make sure it isn't being abused, the public would have a right to be a little skeptical. And I think that's another goal we have to set in this whole process is a little more transparency. When you look at the Emergency Assistance Unit, anyone who's been up there, and I have, it is not an overly appealing place. It's not the kind of place I think a lot of people go to thinking, hey, this is my ticket to affordable housing. I'm going to go through all this. I don't think a lot of people displace their families in the search for affordable housing. I'm sure some have thought of it. I'm sure some do it. I think the question is not, are we going to create the perfect human being? The question is, can we keep anything that might appear to be insincere to a minimum? And I actually think all of us who are progressives have a burden to the public to show that, in fact, we are putting those controls in place and that when we say we need resources to protect people in need, that we actually can prove it.
Can I kick in here a minute?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Bill de Blasio said he wanted to put it in the context of today. Today just happens to be the day that Mayor Bloomberg announced his doomsday budget. And just to put us in context here, one of the things he said is that we're going to close down the Prospect Park Zoo and the Queens Zoo. So not only are we going to have a lot of homeless people, we're going to have a lot of homeless zoo animals to deal with shortly. Right. Now, I tried to put this in context in the beginning. I said the Department of Homeless Services spends $500 million a year. I just called the zoo this afternoon. They spend $8 million a year. The two zoos combined spend $8 million, but the zoos are going to be the ones that go, and the homeless shelter, the homeless system, is going to be the one to stay. Now, just be clear on one thing. All the people up here on this panel are talking about this wonderful decree and that consent and this law and this lawsuit and everything. All of them are spending your money. Everything they do comes out of tax money, absolutely every penny. And what they're doing when they're saying, let's expand this, they want more of your money.
Oh, you got some government
now,
contracts.
This gentleman here said New York is a city of migrants. A lot of people move here. Well, that's true, but a lot of people move out, too. And there's an awful lot of people moving out of New York City right now. And
But I
moving
think
out for one reason,
Bill,
and that's because they're sick of supporting this
But you get
this
paid by
welfare.
Rupert Murdoch. You get paid by Rupert Murdoch, so
I don't
you're
get
spending
paid.
his money, right?
Well, being paid by a private business is different than reaching in taxpayers'
With an
funds.
But
agenda.
Bill,
A
in
private
fairness,
business with
I
an
think
agenda.
you would admit,
No, it is.
Bill, I think in fairness you would admit that if we were to close down the Department of Homeless Services, which obviously my alma mater and I admire, we wouldn't be spending zero. There is a cost, and I actually think Patrick is right in citing the study, the Dennis Cohen study from Pennsylvania, that it costs as much to keep somebody homeless as it costs to keep them on the house.
Let me try
Well,
to see if I can get
somehow
a
it
couple of
employs an awful lot of people who are homeless.
Let me just try to get a couple. We're running out
I'm
of time.
from Queens College, and I just want to address this since we're here to help. Since we're here to address the issue of how to help the poor in order to prevent the homelessness. Those that claim to be poor or that have low incomes, wouldn't it be better to indicate their income, to show their income for the landlords, and for the landlords to establish some kind of rent for them to keep their apartment and not be on the streets, and also for the governments to provide some kind of help in order to keep them in the apartment that they're living in instead of just kicking them out and looking for Section 8 and
Well, I don't know that
subsidies
I don't know
apartments.
that you have a case in which the landlord's going to be the one to judge the income, but one of the things we've been talking about is, in fact, the Section 8 vouchers and various ways in which there's rental assistance given to individuals based on their income and based on the cost of the apartment.
Well, we're also actually another idea that's just come up recently. I think you're ahead of the curve on this. Is that there's an idea of the community stability tax credit, which could help prevent homelessness. I think is more broadly an affordable housing measure, and will be introduced into the council shortly. It has been introduced in Albany. Idea that, in fact, a landlord that is trying to do the right thing by a tenant, and there are thousands and thousands of good landlords. Bill, I hate to burst your bubble. There are thousands of good landlords who, in fact, are compassionate, and I see this in the neighborhoods I represent. A lot of the housing costs are going through the roof in a place like Park Slope, where I live. A lot of the families that have lived there for 1, 2, 3 generations are at a point, if they're renters, where they simply can't stay. And landlords, particularly in smaller buildings, are continually giving people a break on the rent because there's a personal relationship and there's a bond and there's sort of a neighborhood fabric that a lot of landlords, including newcomers to the neighborhood, do not want to break. We're trying to reward that behavior with this concept by basically splitting the difference between what the market rent should be and what the landlord's actually charging the tenant. Example, if the market rent should be $2,000, the landlord's only charging $1,000. We'll give them a $500 subsidy. They'll eat the other $500, and the tenant still pays the original $1,000. So it's a way of really encouraging and rewarding landlords to do the right thing.
Let me try to get one more quick question.
I'm Latoya Pope with the CUNY Bachelorette Program, and I had a question for Mr. Tucker. You said earlier that you thought the solution would be to build more housing units, but don't you think that would cause like dependencies on the system more so than projects like Section 8 housing and some shelters? Building more housing, yeah, there's supply and demand, but the more housing that goes up, the easier it is to stay in housing. Wouldn't that cause a dependency in the system? No?
People would be dependent on, dependency on what? Somebody that you rent an apartment from?
On staying in developments like that. It would make it easier for them to stay. The more houses that are built, the easier it is to stay in there. whereas now there's housing is limited, so it's really hard for people to live off of the system.
So it's better not to have enough housing?
I'm asking you the question.
Well, I'm trying to figure out the question. Yeah, right.
You said
turning a philosophy on you.
There's enough. I wish you people
should
could
be
spend
obsolete.
it.
You
I
left
would,
him speechless.
I would challenge any of you to go. I would challenge anybody.
them all being rid of, so.
Yeah, I would challenge anybody to go to Chicago. I've been trying to get the news channels to do this for 5 years. Just go to Chicago and see what it's like to rent an apartment there. They have apartment agencies that solicit your business. That they say they love to see people from New York City because it's like seeing people get out of prison. They take them around and they say, oh, you can have this one, you can have this one. And then people say, where are the lines? How come nobody else is looking at this apartment now? When are you going to charge me my fee? They don't. They actually, the landlords in Chicago now are giving away $1,500 certificates at Bed Bath & Beyond, trying to lure tenants. This is what a normal housing market is like, but unfortunately.
Well, I think we're going to find we may be finding that as you've seen a lot of concessions when my during the
you got a bit of a glut now in New York because of
during the
vacancy.
depression. My folks used to talk about how they would move every couple of months. They would get the concession, and then when they had to start paying rent, they would move to another
People used to move every year to get a new paint job.
You have
New York was known as the city of nomads. This is before rent control. New York was known as the city of nomads. You couldn't keep people. People would put their furniture in storage for the summer and rent another apartment when they got back.
But as it seems that again when you look at Battery Park City and places like that are having a glut of apartments and aren't able to fill them up, that's a very different situation than when you're talking about things at the bottom of the market that the kinds of people we're talking about are going to be able to afford. So let me just close this out a little bit and work off of Bill's point. Bill has a great deal of faith in the market and thinks that the government keeps getting in the way of the market and that the market has that the invisible hand of the market would solve a lot of these problems.
Look, the market has a role to play, and we also have
Very quickly, by the way.
Well, it has a role to play, and we have to understand its limitations. And I think the best solution mixes the two, which is public subsidy of market housing.
I mean, it's not about ideology. I mean, I hear that, and that's just ideology. Let's talk about what works. We know it works to reduce homelessness. We did it a decade ago. We just need to do more of it. The problem is government has completely, or not completely, it's largely withdrawn from its role.
But as it relates to health care, the market has failed, and it's failing, and we have to look at homelessness, street homelessness, as a health care crisis and a mental health care crisis.
Let me say goodbye. As usual, I've run out of time without controlling the time. Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for a very spirited discussion, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.